Africa says no to Europe on new trade deals. Most African leaders reject a new EU proposed economic partnership at the first European-African summit in 7 years. Is Africa missing an opportunity, or is it finally standing up for itself because it has other investors interested? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. They're calling it a new era, a partnership between equals. Europe and Africa say they want to replace centuries of suspicion with economic and political tie-ins on an unprecedented scale. But already it appears to be falling at the first hurdle. Almost all the leaders of the 53-member African Union and the 27-nation European Union have been meeting in Portugal. It's their first such summit in 7 years. But it's been marred by discord over trade, with the suggestion that most African leaders reject current plans for economic partnership agreements with Europe. They fear the deals would leave them worse off.
We are not talking anymore about EPAs. We have rejected them. For us, it's over. When we meet again, we will rediscuss it. The European Union will present the EPAs and will present another thing. But today, as I said during the plenary session, many times the African states reject the EPAs.
Well, the summit comes at a time of growing interest in Africa, home to an abundance of natural resources and large populations hungry for consumer goods. Africa is now a battlefield for Chinese and European influence. Yet China and Europe differ greatly in their approaches to Africa. China, which has billions invested in Africa, insists its deals are purely economic and that it has no interest in politics. Steering clear of any criticism of African leaders, China says it is investing in Africa's future by building infrastructure and training Africa's workforce. In contrast, Europe regularly criticizes many of the African states' human rights records and has often pegged better trade relations to improvements in human rights. Many African leaders also criticize the EU, saying its high trade tariffs discriminate against Africa. Well, joining us to discuss the outcome of the European-African Summit are our guests in London, Cameron Duadu, African Affairs Analyst, and Andrew Leng, China Specialist and formerly Hong Kong's Chief Representative to the United Kingdom. In Vienna, John Kotsopoulos, Policy Analyst at the European Policy Centre. Welcome, all of you. Mr. Duadu, the majority of African leaders have rejected the trade deals demanded by the EU. With so much at stake, what went wrong?
It's because the Europeans and the Africans have been engaging in a dialogue of the deaf for a long time. This trade business has been spoken about since about 1975. We had the Lomé I agreement, then the Lomé II agreement, then the Cotonou agreement. It's not just Africans, but African and Pacific and Caribbean countries all have the same interest. You see, you have to understand this. Most African and developing country economies were actually set up by the Europeans. They brought certain industries in a certain way to Africa. That certain way was to ensure that they got raw materials from Africa, took them to the metropolitan countries, and processed them there, so that all the work and other benefits that accrued from the raw materials, the value added, stayed in Europe. Then they sold finished goods to Africans. But because African raw materials were not bringing in enough foreign exchange, in many instances, Africans found that they couldn't buy the consumer goods. So what did they do? They tried import substitution. And to whom did they go for factories? The Europeans. The Europeans said, all right, we've got you again, we'll build factories for you. But they build factories without vertical integration. Therefore, when you have the factory, you need inputs from the same European countries in order that the factories may work.
Okay, excuse me interrupting you there, Mr. Duadu. I'd like to fast forward to the problems that the summit faced, and if I could put that to you, Mr. Kotsopoulos. I mean, where did it go wrong?
The summit overall, I'm not sure if it went completely wrong. Let's not forget that both sides have been in negotiation for this summit and specifically for the joint strategy for more than a year, and not just at the heads of government level, but also including civil society and NGOs. There were no surprises that came out of this summit. We knew that specifically the economic partnership agreements and human rights in the form of Mugabe's presence would be the contentious issues, and those were the ones that of course came to the fore.
But considering both sides have stumbled at the first hurdle, and I'm talking about the economics, that poses a big problem.
Yeah, but let's not forget as well, there are 4 regions in Africa that are negotiating the EPAs, and 2 of them, prior to this summit, already approved of the first stage of implementation of the EPAs. So we heard earlier at the beginning a French commentator. That's because the French side, has yet to approve of the EPAs. But overall, it's a process that I don't see stopping. Don't forget also that the former relationship in the form of Yaoundé, Lomé, and Cotonou now was ruled to contravene WTO regulations. There was no other choice for both the European and the African side.
Okay, Mr. Duadu, it was supposed to be a plan to forge a new partnership for equals. I mean, how is that ever possible when there's so much disparity between both sides, economically in particular?
That's why I said that it's a dialogue of the deaf. This thing has been going on for over 40 years. And the intrinsic problems that militate against agreement have not really been settled. The Africans want to be able to have a sustained economic development program. But they can't do that if they cannot sell their goods at prices that make sense to them and are realistic in the modern world. If Barbados wants, for instance, to sell sugar in Europe, it finds that European beet sugar producers who are subsidized by Europe are competing against their products. Botswana wants to sell beef in Europe. What happens? It comes up against competition from European beef farmers who are subsidized.
Yes, can I throw in a quick statistic here? We believe that each cow in the EU receives a government subsidy of $2 a day. I mean, that's more than a farmer in sub-Saharan Africa earns in a day.
Absolutely. And the Africans have been pointing this out every single time they meet. But because the Europeans have economic clout, they dangle aid before them and say, look, if you don't sign on the dotted line, you are not going to get the aid. That is why they've been trying to split the whole group. And somebody mentioned that some countries have already signed. It's because they want aid. Their balance of payments are in a perilous situation, and they don't find themselves able to negotiate sensibly at all.
Okay, they seem to be negotiating, excuse me interrupting, they seem to be negotiating very well with China, Mr. Leng. I mean, this seems an appropriate time for China to increase its growing presence there.
Well, China is already in Africa in a big way, and that's why this raises concern and is acting as a kind of wake-up call for the European Union. And China, of course, engagement in Africa is very, very different from the previous colonial times. Is focusing not only on energy, on the purchase of energy and resources, but also building the infrastructure, and as well as helping with the training of the kind of medical personnel, engineers, and so on and so forth. And some of the African countries regard that kind of engagement as more conducive to its own development, because apart from aid, a lot of African countries are focusing on trade, because trade is a kind of empowerment. Aid is really relying on other people's handouts. So that kind
and
of
of course, Mr. Leng, there are no strings attached either.
Absolutely. But on the other hand, China is now have to confront with this kind of sensitivities, both internally to Africa and also internationally, because there are some issues which raise international concerns.
Mr. Katsopoulos, do you think that having China as a competitor has forced the EU to change its approach in Africa?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the key factors. Really, since 2000, we've seen an enormous amount of growth, not only of Chinese investment in Africa, but also African exports to China and other Asian markets. In fact, they're almost at par now with exports that go to the European Union. There's absolutely no doubt that that China has done this, and I don't think it's a bad thing at all. It was time to reevaluate the relationship between Africa and Europe, and if China was going to be one of the reasons for reevaluating that relationship, so be it.
Okay, gentlemen, time for a short break now, but when we come back, we take a closer look at the issues that have divided the two sides. Stay with us.